I wish to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations on which the research team operates in British Columbia. We have no conflicts of interest to declare. Overviews synthesize the results of multiple systematic reviews and help inform evidence-based practice. Several author teams have expressed concerns about the volume of systematic reviews published, which are overlapping in content. Conflicting results and/or conclusions across reviews and perhaps overviews on the same topic can create confusion or uncertainty for decision makers who are required to choose among all competing treatments and may impact and delay clinical decision making. Our objectives were then to assess the prevalence of overviews, their citation rates and journal impact factors. Using a sample of these overviews, we'll then categorize overviews as being broad or narrow in scope, and assess if overviews overlap in PICO eligibility criteria, and if yes, then categorize them as identical, nearly identical, partial, or subsumed overlap, which I will be describing later on. So the results of this presentation is based on two studies published in Research Synthesis Methods, the first one being a bibliometric study of overviews of systematic reviews, and the second one being the topic of this presentation, a new taxonomy developed for overlap across overviews of systematic reviews. So what is the prevalence of overviews and are they growing in number? Overviews are growing in number, as you can see here in this figure, not surprisingly. So a search for overviews and their synonyms in Medline, the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, and Epistemonicus identified 1,218 overviews published from 2000 to 2020, and 3/4 of which were published in the most recent 5-year period. We identified 332 overviews published in 2020, which is equivalent to 1 overview published per day. We analyzed 542 overviews published between 2000 and 2018 in greater detail and found that they were published in 307 journals, the most prevalent being the Cochrane database of systematic reviews at 8%, PLAS 1 at 3%, and the Sao Paulo Medical Journal at 2%. We found a median 8.5 citations per overview per year, published in journals with a mean journal impact factor of 4.4. 70% of overviews were published in journals with impact factors between 0.05 and 3.97. And in multivariate analysis, overviews with a high number of citations and journal impact factors had more authors, larger sample sizes, were open access, and reported the funding source. So, are overviews being published on the same topic? We defined broad overviews as addressing first, more than one distinct population or a generalized population, and second, multiple interventions, for example, aerobics exercise and resistance training, for the outcomes of interest. We define narrow overviews as covering only one population and one intervention. As seen in the tables at the bottom of the slide, broad overviews aimed to answer broad questions, had wider range of study populations, conditions, interventions, and contexts, were more resource intensive, and allowed for policy relevance. For example, overviews have informed clinical practice guidelines and government health policies. Narrow overviews, in contrast, aim to answer narrow, focused clinical questions. They identify and explore reasons for variation in systematic review results, interpretation, or conclusions. They can be completed more quickly compared to broad overviews, and they may have limited generalizability to different populations or settings. So what is topic overlap? So we define topic overlap as duplication of PICO eligibility criteria and not reported as an update or a replication. We further created a taxonomy of 4 types of overlap, namely identical overlap, which is when the aims included PICO and study designs were identical to one another. Nearly identical is when the eligible populations, interventions, comparisons, and at least one outcome were identical to another overview. Partial overlap is when 2 overviews had at least one component of PICO in common. And subsumed overlap we defined as when the PICO, or the population, intervention, and comparison, and at least one outcome was addressed in full by a second or broader overview. So subsummation can be visualized by the narrow overview in blue, which is subsumed by the broad overview in black and white stripes, seen here top right. So observed overlap can be legitimately justified for several reasons. For example, differences in purposes, out-of-dateness or emergence of new evidence to update the old overview, inappropriate or invalid methods used by the overview, overviews of low methodological quality, so you can justify doing an overview with very strict and systematic methods. Existing overviews are narrow, therefore broad overviews are warranted. And finally, replication by independent and conflict-free academics. So without these justifications, overlapping overviews represent wasted efforts on the part of investigators and can confuse and mislead clinicians and policymakers. So what is the prevalence of overlap that we found? So of the 541 overviews we examined, 169 or 1/3 overlapped across similar PICO. They fell within 20 out of 22 WHO ICD-10 medical classifications, as seen in the bubble chart on the right. So of the 169 overlapping overviews, no overviews were found with exactly identical aims and PICO eligibility criteria. 15 or 9% had nearly identical overlap. 123 or 73% had partial overlap, and 31 or 18% subsumed of others. So there's often overlap between the scopes of different systematic reviews without them being coterminous, because some cover broad and other cover narrow topic areas. So I just wanted to present an example of 3 overviews that were found on the topic of acupuncture for palliative cancer care. These overviews were partially overlapping in various combinations of their population, intervention, and outcomes. The overview A by Wu, seen here in blue at the top, had the broadest set of interventions, namely any type of acupuncture therapy for cancer patients receiving palliative care. The overview B by Towler, seen here in red, addressed a narrower intervention, namely acupuncture excluding any acupuncture therapy for a slightly broader population of cancer patients receiving palliative care or supportive care. And the overview C by Ezzo, in striped black and white, had the narrowest intervention, namely acupuncture only on one point, which was P6, and investigated the broadest population, so cancer patients with chemotherapy-induced nausea, and the highest number of outcomes, namely vomiting, postoperative nausea and vomiting, and pregnancy-related nausea and vomiting. So nausea and vomiting were outcomes common to all 3 overviews. The partial overlap across the three can be seen here in purple. Purple stripes, red stripes, and blue stripes in the bottom figure on the left. We note that not one overview fully subsumed another. So in conclusion, our methodological assessment identified 31% of 541 overviews dated between 2000 and 2018 that overlapped in content across 20 WHO ICD-10 medical classifications and 62 subtopics. Though we observe slight differences in the scope of the overlapping overviews, we feel that at least some of this represents unnecessary overlap. Our taxonomy of overlap can be used by other methodologists studying overlap across randomized control trials, systematic reviews, and overviews. Although future research into overlap in these other study types, so namely systematic reviews using our taxonomy, is needed. Currently, there's no dedicated database registry for protocols of overviews, such as there is for systematic reviews like Prospero. A dedicated database for overview protocols, as well as the development of a mesh term for overviews, would help in their identification by prospective overview authors who, in finding a similar overview, could choose a different topic or a new scope to explore. Authors of overviews can use this study and the sample of overviews to identify gaps in the evidence for future analysis and topics that are already studied, which need not be duplicated. A multiplicity of overviews on the same topic adds to the ongoing waste of research resources, time, and effort across medical disciplines. And as a little final note, we do not advocate that authors conduct overviews of overviews or meta overviews and try to explain differences across multiple overviews, as this would produce more redundant and potentially useless research. So I thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions.